Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is meant for educational purposes only. Hello, and welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm your host today, Sarah Westbrook, joined by Dr. Emily Bashah. Hi, Emily. Welcome.
Sarah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I am really excited about your book, and I wanted you to go ahead and take a few minutes and introduce yourself and tell us what inspired you to write your book, Addictive Ideologies, Finding Meaning and Agency When Politics Fail You. And tell us a little bit about your book, what inspired you to write it, and what you're hoping to gain from that project.
Yes, thank you. I'm equally interested in your trauma bonding book new release. So I will definitely be reading that as a psychologist. That's something that often comes up in my clinical work. So thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a bit about the background. So Paul and I, my co-author, Paul Johnson, we are a couple, which is also really interesting to learn more about you and your husband and the work that you do on your podcast. And this has been a joint venture. I'm a psychologist, as I said before, so I do clinical work as well as forensic work in the criminal court settings as well as immigration court. So I do expert evaluations on people who are serving life sentences or being potentially convicted of first-degree murder, multiple homicides, domestic terrorism, various forms of extremism as well. And this is something that really concerned Paul and I recently about what's happening, just not necessarily nationally, but also globally, a growing rise of extremism. And Paul's main focus, so he comes at it more from the political route. He was the former mayor of Phoenix, serving 2 terms in the 90s, and continued to work very closely within politics. He's also an entrepreneur, and we co-host the Optimistic American podcast together. And his main drive is really political reform and how to reduce extremism in politics today. Now,
How fascinating.
yeah, it's really interesting to see how our worlds kind of come together and bridge
Yeah.
to understand really complex questions. The book,
So I'm sorry, you said the podcast is Optimistic America?
Optimistic American.
Oh, Optimistic American. I love that title. I'm gonna have to check that out. Thank you.
Yes,
Keep
please.
going.
Thank you. And actually we do take quite a bit of the teachings from our book and separate it out into different segments on our podcast and talking about different things that people can do to promote agency in their lives, how to reduce extremism, their parenting tips and strategies, and psychological factors such as maladaptive coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms, and trauma, how trauma affects the brain and the body and behaviors and emotions and impacts on relationships. So there's a lot in there depending on where you're coming from and what you're looking for. Going back to our book and just a bit about my family history, this book has been kind of a seed that has been planted in me ever since I was a child. So, I'm impacted by intergenerational trauma. My parents are Jews who suffered persecution in Iraq during the rise of the Ba'ath Party with Saddam Hussein. And at the time, Jews' assets were seized, their houses were taken from them, their businesses were looted, and they were not given any permission to leave. And many had been, we've been in Baghdad, in Babylon since 500 BC. We are Arab
Right.
Jews. And so it was a real challenge just was during my parents' generation, when Jews were starting to be publicly hanged and disappeared. So my grandfather, my mother's father, he was a prime target. He was Jewish. He was influential.
Mhm.
He was respected within the community. People invested with him. We don't know too much about him, but from what we know, that he was maybe handling some trades, and he disappeared one night, and we never heard from him again. He was taken into a prison called the Palace of No Return, because once you go in, there's no going
Right, you
out.
don't come out.
Yeah, in fact, there were mass
Wow.
graves found behind this prison. Later, we were able to obtain some declassified CIA reports and discovered that Saddam was holding torture parties. I mean, I don't want to take us off topic, but the main
Right.
thing that Paul and I were really looking at was, how is it that other Arabs there just participated in this? I mean, this isn't just
Right.
the work of one man. This
Mhm.
is the work of many, and the social milieu and the culture at the time had to condone it in order for it to really take effect.
Right,
And
there's like a level of groupthink because these
yes,
people are doing it, I'm doing it, and it's like, were you doing it to stay safe? Were you doing it because you agreed with the ideologies? You know, what was the motivation for being so horrific to humanity because of a religious or a cultural or an ethnic, um, oh goodness, my brain just went blank. Group, there it is. Group, like what was the motivation for this? So it's just it's fascinating to me, especially because we've seen it repeat so many times in world history. Like this isn't an isolated incident. We see this type of harsh treatment of somebody who's different than us over and over and over again.
precisely. You hit the nail on the head. Exactly. And that's what Paul and I found. So we were looking across various genocides across the
Mhm.
globe, various forms of acts of terrorism and growing rises of extremism. And what we saw was these were all linked to an ideology. And those ideologies that turn violent tend to separate people by groups and see the world through the lens of the oppressed and the oppressor. So they see the oppressed as the outsider, they see themselves as victims. And you're right, it is a groupthink type of mentality. And it you tend to isolate yourself and separate and dehumanize and objectify the outgroup. It becomes very convenient at that point to dehumanize them and condone violence towards them or vengeance towards them. And the ideology really tends to be quite simple. It doesn't tend to be too complex. And as individuals get involved in such ideologies, they become ostracized from their family, their friends, either by choice or aside from their choice, leading people to associate predominantly really with individuals who share that same ideology and more
Mhm.
extremist forms of it. So now this becomes more dangerous and more violent prone and aggressor prone. And this can lead to increased radicalization and more violence as we see. So the traits of an addiction are really formed by those who continue to engage in behaviors that harm themselves and the people they care about, and yet they cannot stop.
Right. Right. I love that you're talking about this because you're talking about it on the large scale. But one of the things that is very fascinating to me is that as my husband and I left our religious group, it was very fascinating to watch our, you know, families of origin, especially my husband's family of origin, interpret that as though they were the victims of us walking away from that ideology. And then the way that they attacked us and treated us was very out of character for how they interact with humanity in general, and yet they felt like they were justified or righteous or on God's errand because we were somehow now dangerous because we left a system. And it's we call it the persecution complex within Mormonism, that they perceive that they are the victim and that when somebody leaves, that's a direct attack against them. And so it's very fascinating to me because you're going to see these same ideals or ideologies on like a micro level and then on that macro level. So I find this just really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, the perceptions that become skewed that you tend to believe in, it's hard to find the truth and to know what is right versus wrong. And especially when there's so much emotional investment and then it gets
Mhm.
reinforced by the community, it can be really destabilizing
Right.
psychologically to know, well, what is the truth? There's all this like confusion that's happening. And if the guiding principle is based on moral superiority, then one would want to gravitate towards that. No one wants to be
Right.
in the inferior position.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Did you know a 2018 study showed half of prenatal vitamins tested had unacceptable levels of heavy metals? I'm Kat, mother of 3 and founder of Ritual. When I was 4 months pregnant, I couldn't find a prenatal I could trust, so I created my own. Ours is made traceable, third-party tested for heavy metals, and recently earned the Purity Award from the Clean Label Project. But don't just take my word for it. Get 25% off at ritual.com/prenatal.
Diagnose Zeithochdruck. Wir verschreiben ausreichend Zeit für PatientInnen. Herzlich willkommen im Krankenhaus St. Josef Braunau. Jetzt bewerben als Ärztin oder Arzt für Innere Medizin. khbr.at/Karriere.
And so if the narrative that you're being told is you are morally superior and the others, whether they're the ones departing from us, are the inferiors and we are the victims, that helps to simplify the conflict. And we do see that there is a lot of cognitive dissonance that occurs in which there's tension between what one believes and one's values versus what they do. And when
Mhm.
that tension arises, people have to find a way to resolve that tension. And they'll often do that by just rationalizing or justifying or engaging in some kind of defense mechanism, um, because there is this tension that exists. And so that could even polarize them even further and say, well, no, I want to be part of this moral superior race or group or
Right.
ideology, or culture or subculture, whatever that is. And so I just need to push away some of those other values, even though these are my family members, even though I love them, even though this is my daughter or my son, and
Right.
I don't want to lose them. But that's in conflict directly with what I'm taught to believe and what I want to
Mhm.
believe because it
Right.
feels good.
Right.
And
And then when we point it out and where we say things like, "Hey, that's in direct conflict," the brain will dissonance that and give it a reason why it's okay in this circumstance.
yeah, we have to find a way to justify it and rationalize it in our mind to preserve our ego. And
Mhm.
and one of the things that Paul and I are really promoting is find your own agency. It's okay to have a fragile ego. We all experience vulnerability and insecurity and
Right.
doubt and shame or guilt for different things. The more you try and hide it, the more you try and keep it as a secret, the more you try and create this alter part of yourself that is a shameful part of yourself that has to be kept in secret, the more that tension is going to rise, the harder you're going to have to work, the more emotional intensity and energy you're going to have to
Right.
exert in order to do that. And you're just not going to be aligned. I usually see this in the criminal court. Like there's so much tension that gets built up that has to get exercised somehow. And it may not be intentional, it could be unintentional, but it's just this building of this perfect storm until you see things erupt. But as an outsider, it's easier to see
Right.
how that happened, what that buildup was, and where those interventions could have happened along the way to prevent this catastrophe or crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are you hoping for your audience to gain as they read your book? What is their takeaway going to be from Addictive Ideologies?
Well, we really want to find balance in this world and not have people follow this rhetoric that they're hearing on the nightly news or what media is promoting, especially as the political campaigns are ramping up. I'm seeing clinically people are really just exhausted, and
Yes.
even they're not even sure, like, okay, these conversations are a no-go whenever
Mm-hmm.
members get together. We can't talk about politics. We can't
Right.
talk about presidential races. We can't talk about, things that are upsetting us in the system, and race issues. And
Mm-hmm.
there's just this abundance of things that are just becoming such heated topics. And I think, why can't we talk about them? How did we get
Right.
this far that it is so extreme that we have to dehumanize and objectify and profile people to see, well, are you in my camp? Are you in the other camp?
Right. I see the
And
same things in my clinic. So I own my practice. I'm an LPC, and
yes,
I'm seeing extreme anger and very polarized thinking, a lot of anger, and then on the flip side, just helplessness and hopelessness. Like I cannot find an environment anymore where I feel safe and where I can just express my opinion without fear of being attacked for thinking differently. And yeah, it's very polarized is what I'm seeing, and it's really difficult. And when I'm able to dig in with my clients, what I'm finding is almost all of them are somewhere in between these polarized columns, we'll say. But then when we find out, no, you're actually in the middle, it's suddenly like, oh, I can be safe in the middle. I don't have to be pulled to one side or the other. But then they'll come back the following week and we're back to that polarization. And I think it has a lot to do with just the constant exposure and expectation that you have to choose a side.
yes, and we need to build that ego strength and resilience inside of ourselves and not personalize everything in order to
Yes.
be able to have difficult conversations, even if we continue to disagree and are left without a resolution. How powerful would that be? I
It
mean,
would be
that
amazing.
that is
Well,
growth at
yes,
this
it would
point.
be amazing across all issues within mental and behavioral health, within politics, within religion, yes, if we could relearn or maybe learn for the first time how to do that, we would, yes, amazing growth in humanity. Absolutely. Let's see. So we've got a question. How do we connect? I'm not sure what you're asking me here, Alex. Describe the sides that people see. Oh, so yes, Alex is asking us to describe those sides. So Alex, I'm actually gonna, this is my producer asking me a question, which I absolutely love his questions that come up in the background, because that helps me identify when maybe our audience, like if I'm too much in clinical speak and whatnot. And so let me answer. So what I'm seeing in my clinic politically is you're either like 100% for Trump, and everything that Trump does is golden and perfect and good, or you're completely against him and 100% for Biden. And it's so that's what I'm seeing in my clinic as the elections ramp up, if I'm going to use that example. And really what happens in my clinic when I'm able to break that down is that I have people who will say things like, I really appreciated and felt that Trump did great things for our economy, but I don't like how he treats foreign politics, for example. And I don't like the way that he talks about people who disagree with him. And I don't like the way that he disrespects, women. And I don't like these things. And then I've got, on the Biden side, well, Biden is anti-Trump, therefore he is perfect. But then when we break that down in my clinic, because I will ask questions, what are you seeing that resonates with you about, one side or the other? And then what about that side that you resonate do you struggle with? And so that way I'm helping them bridge that gap and see that on both sides there can be positive and negative. And, Emily, I don't know if you want to say something to this, but in my clinic, what I see is that as my clients are able to safely explore the pros and cons of both sides, pull it together and reconnect the political values with their personal morals and standards, their personal values, and see that there can be strengths and weaknesses, things they agree with, things they disagree with, and they're able to speak it out loud. Suddenly they have so much more in common with the people, quote unquote, on the other side of them, that their humanity, it's like it wakes back up. They're able to empathize with others better, and they're able to have those difficult conversations. And then the challenge that I see is that we'll make, progress in session, and then when they come back, you can see some relapse, and then we make that progress again. And for me, after a couple of repeats with that client, they are able to maintain that less black and white thinking. They're able to kind of stay more in that middle ground, and they're able to see that those who disagree with them still have value and that we can treat them with respect, even though they're voicing their opinions in a very loud and intense way, as if it's the only right way. They learn how to change their language in such a way that they are no longer in that extreme side, that polarized black and white thinking. Rather, they're very comfortable in the gray, which allows them to hold space for those still struggling on the outside. And my hope, my dream is that everybody can eventually learn how to come back to that gray and say, hey, where do we agree? Where do we disagree? In order to prevent that polarization. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. You summarized it very well. I'm very impressed. Yes. And making it really relatable clinically. I think, one of the challenges in doing this work is not sounding too scientific and in a way that people then can't really digest it or understand it. And it's so important for me to really work on that, because I don't want to just speak to a clinical community of professionals. I want to speak to the public. I want to speak to my mother. I want to speak to my father. I want to speak to my friends. I want to speak to my clients. I want to speak to my husband, my family members, all of them. And I think, an extension of what you were saying, I agree with everything you just said, is let's go before that happened. What are the risk factors that lead someone to get to that black and white thinking? And usually there's a deep-seated insecurity, a fragility, and there's fear, and there's resentment, there's anger. And what happens in the brain when a politician or a leader or a religious leader or anyone you want to say can find that way to hit the amygdala in the brain, we call it the amygdala hijack. And what it does is when the fear or that sense of life and endangerment, or my life is threatened and this heightened endangerment is happening, the frontal lobe doesn't activate as well and doesn't function as well, because we're going to our primitive brain. It's the limbic system. And that is necessary for our survival. We go into this fight, flight, freeze response. Media knows this. Politicians know this. They have scientists and psychologists helping them to be effective and
Right.
they have a single shot at doing this, and they profit from it. So once we understand that, and this can be, any other kind of leader, it could be dictators, it could be other people, but it's important to know that there is this motivation and how they're employing that part to take control and overpower us.
Mhm.
And if we allow ourselves to experience that fear and paranoia and resentment and anger, uh, we are giving up our power away to other people. And this is when it
Right.
becomes quite dangerous, because we're not using our frontal lobe that gives us that higher seat of thinking, of being able to discern and judge and think critically and, well, look for evidence for, look for evidence against. The other
Right. So
thing I
for my listeners, I describe this system as the frontal cortex and the amygdala as like a dimmer switch, that the more that amygdala is activated, the less critical thinking, the less creative, the less logical we become, as if the amygdala has taken over. And I'll call it, in my podcast, my listeners have heard me call it the amygdalal response. And I know that's not an actual clinical term, but I've turned the amygdala into a verb and an adjective instead of a noun. Because so, I'm saying this because I want my listeners to go, okay, this is what Sarah's talking about, and now this is what Emily is talking about, that amygdala hijack means we lose objectivity and the ability to remain in a reality-based thinking place because we're driven by fear. Would you be willing, Emily, to kind of explain what you mean by ego fragility? Because you've said that a couple of times. I'd like to kind of break that terminology down. What do you mean by that? And how do you identify that fragility?
Yeah, I think, going to Jonathan Haidt's book would probably be a good reference here. And he was really breaking down this earlier theory, a notion of anti-fragility. Concepts of anti-fragility are really based on the idea that individuality, agency, independence, and creativity are all concepts that come from one's confidence in themselves. And this
Mhm.
happens over time with the experience of learning. So we can look at, parenting a child, for instance, because there's a lot of like parenting books on this, like what is the best way to parent my child? Is sheltering them, and being a helicopter parent actually harming and not helping? Well, how much do I let them discover on their own, while also maintaining physical safety?
Right.
So there's a lot of conversation about that in this sphere at the moment. And there's some tension about it too, in finding, well, how are policies being built in the schools surrounding this, and what are the theories that are guiding it, and what are really the recommendations,
Right.
from higher up and top down. So this happens over time with the experience of learning. And while a parent might do a good job in a child's infancy forming a bond with their child, if they become over dominant, constantly seeking to keep their children safe, then the child does not have the experience or exposure to succeeding and failing on their own, that they get to
Right.
own that experience, that I did this,
Mhm.
or I fell or I failed, let me try again.
Right.
And these experiences offer such a vast amount of learning through
Mhm.
exploration, discovery, and collaboration. And that children who have anti-fragile, or we can call resilient systems, that can then be enhanced through building up their ego strength, building up their self-esteem, building up their
Mhm.
confidence, building up their belief and faith in themselves, building up hope and optimism. Like, okay, I'm struggling today, but I know it's not the end of the world. I'm going to be able to learn from this experience, and I'm going to continue with courage. And sometimes courage is like a really quiet voice inside. It's not necessarily a roar, and
Right.
that's okay. And that is yours, and you get to own that.
Mhm.
And it's interesting when people come into therapy and say, well, I have self-esteem problems, I just want to improve my self-esteem. And I tell them, well, I can challenge the way you're thinking about it. We can change the way you're thinking about it. But until you start doing things differently, you're not going to
Mm-hmm.
believe it for yourself until you experience it.
Right.
So you need to take risks. And the only way we can take risks, we can build this, I call it, it's a behavioral experiment. I don't know if you're going to, how it's going to go for you. I don't know what you're going to learn through it, but I trust you. I have faith in you. And we're going to do this together, and we're going to learn from this, and we're going to grow from this. Let's, are you in? Basically.
Right. Yep. That's how I approach it too.
Yeah. So, that is, ego strength is connected to agency that we were talking about before.
I love it. So how do you identify, like, when we're talking about avoiding or being able to recognize where we're starting to struggle with that extremism or that polarized thinking? What are some of our first steps that we need to do to recognize that it could be problematic? When do you see that? How do you do that? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So Paul and I were, when I was giving you that kind of case example of my family, I do want to mention, we actually just came back from Bosnia. We were meeting with political leaders, community leaders, and talking to them about, and just the general public about what had happened during the genocide, what was happening leading up to it, during it, and the 4-year siege in their city. And the horrific losses and attacks on a population to annihilate them, and really trying to unpack and understand how is it that everyday average people participated. And, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the author of the Gulag Archipelago, he's an amazing writer and really describes in depth that the propensity for good and evil exists in all of us. I really believe this. In the forensic work that I do, I see people in prison. Sometimes I'll do risk assessments. I'll go in, or maybe resentencing, or looking at parole release considerations. And some people are really facing life sentences. They have really very little chances or hope of getting out. And, it's amazing to see the kind of human spiritual transformation that occurs within a person, knowing that they're never going to be able to really change their external circumstances. Right. The only control they have is really the human spirit and what they think and how they feel and what they believe in. And to see that level, that high level of transformation is so admiring. I have such a deep, profound respect. It can occur. So whoever,
I've worked in a jail before, and I have a colleague that has spent her entire career working for a prison system, and both of us agree jail and prison is an incredibly spiritual place, and which is so, it almost feels like oxymoronish, if that's a real word, to see these people thrive in these systems and have that spiritual transformation. It's incredible.
I think because they're really confronted with a deep despair. And I think, there's no going back. There's no changing the past. And all you have is really you can stay where you are and remain stagnant. I see that too.
Right.
You could go backwards and regress and become worse. I've seen that too.
Right.
Or you have the opportunity, and this is all part of free will, the choice to improve, to grow. And when people are confronted with that deep despair, at time, seeing that their external circumstances are not changing. Viktor Frankl said this, when we're compelled, when we're unable to change the external circumstances that we're in, we're compelled to change who we are. And the change has to be within, because it can't be on the outside. And I think that is really quite powerful.
head on over to Amazon and buy your copy of Trauma Bonded, a true story of navigating attachments forged in complex PTSD by me, Sarah Westbrook.
So, kind of going back to your question, there was a great researcher, Belanger, who was looking at, the risk factors in addictive ideologies. Well, he called it more like radicalized extremist ideologies. And there's this obsessional component. So you were earlier talking about this black and white thinking, which is a dichotomous thinking. There's all kinds of problematic reasons why, therapists try and move people towards the middle and have more balanced thinking, more in the gray zone, operating in the middle path. We can also call it the wise mind, where you're not really operating on these polarized places, and you can learn techniques and skills to be able to catch yourself when you are in those places and make a shift. But Belanger really describes 4 processes of an ideological obsession that puts one on the path towards violence. And these include, one is moral disengagement, allowing things that you wouldn't normally have allowed before to be permitted. And these could be unethical behaviors and things that you engage in without self-recrimination. So you're not even really engaging in kind of guilt or shame for the things. You're justifying why it was okay. And the second is there's this hatred and resentment that builds from this ideological obsession. And these individuals are easily threatened by information that challenges their beliefs. So now you're starting to see that they're kind of getting guarded. And you can see where conspiracy theories and false and misinformation can also work in here to influence a person.
Right.
The third is
well, and I love that you said, oh goodness, information, that they're threatened by the information, because that's not a real, like, it's data. It's not going to kill you. It's not a real threat. And yet you have that amygdala response and that dissonance that comes because of information that is different than a previously held belief. I just, yes. Keep going. Number 3.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something to really watch for. And it might be easier to see as an outsider, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I have this loved one, this family member who engages in that behavior. He's become more radicalized over time. And yes, I see that, every time I try and tell him like he's wrong or this or that, and then he just shuts down and he doesn't even listen to me. And,
right.
So the third one is this gravitation towards people who think alike and possibly support this violent thinking. So now there's these push and pull factors. So they're starting to push themselves away from people that they love, people they care about, things they used to do, things they used to experience joy and hope and meaning out of. And they're starting to really isolate themselves and moving more towards people who are more radicalized. Fourth is shunning those they disagree with. So now they're really starting to exclude themselves and create the separation of the in-group and the out-group that I talked about before, that has, other dangerous elements to it. And that makes them immune to others who might persuade them to avoid the violence.
Right. So, quick question. One of the things that my husband and I experienced as we left Mormonism, what was that familial shunning, and shunning by those who still were very orthodox, ingrained into the Mormon system. And the idea behind that, because we participated in that shunning, I'm certain that we did during our time as Orthodox practicing Mormons. And the idea was, I'm shunning to protect myself from being contaminated by anti-Mormon ideologies. Is that the same type of dynamic that you're seeing in other forms, like with this political extremism and the other things that you've studied? Is that I'm shunning with the idea that it's protective? Or do you see that shunning for a different intention?
Yeah. And I mean, thinking about this from a group perspective, how powerful is that to have observers see what can happen if you try and leave? And the fear that would then create, and the deeper investment one would make to the group. And we saw this in Nazi Germany. We saw this everywhere. I mean, and same thing in genocides. The people who were on the lines of the perpetrators and the aggressors weren't all bad, weren't all evil. And even Viktor Frankl talked about this. He said, not all of the concentration camp guards, he was an Auschwitz camp survivor, which is unheard of. He said, he wrote about this, not all Nazi concentration camp guards were evil. Actually, some of them were quite pleasant. But every now and then we came across one that really enjoyed making people suffer, really enjoyed that position of power. And so there is this fear, and it works if you're a leader or wanting to create cohesion and obedience among your members, and conformity. I mean, all of those, whether it's a radicalized religious group or other form of extremist group, that can happen. And it does send a message to the members that are kind of in-betweeners that feel like, well, maybe there is something immoral or unethical about this. I don't quite feel right about how they're treating them, but oh my gosh, I don't want that to happen to me. So let me just keep quiet and go with what the group is doing, but not speak out, not protect who I think is being victimized, because I don't want that negativity on me. That's powerful.
Very powerful. I actually covered this a little bit in my book, Trauma Bonded. So my father has a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And as I began to speak out against his narcissistic abuse, his response was to criminalize me with all of my siblings. And so my siblings, who I tried very hard to have a positive relationship with, they can't have a relationship with me and him, and they're going to choose his side because they don't want to, because they see what he's done to me. They see what he's done to my children. They see the things that he says to me. They see how he's contacting the extended family members and warning them about Sarah's mentally unstable and she's a liar, and he has done that, shunning in such a way that he is establishing obedience in those who do not want to become his victim. So you're going to see this on, again, that micro level, and then it just grows. This can happen in very small systems, and it can happen in very large systems. So
wonderful. Sarah, I'm going to have to ask you to be to present also at our podcast. I'd love to interview you about your book.
Anytime.
How it relates to what we're doing. I want to commend you on the courage that it took to make those decisions that you did, in isolation, knowing the consequences and the risks and the pain that the separation would cause you, knowing that was the right thing for you. Again, no one is telling you what the right thing is. Only you are finding that within yourself. And to do that it was so unpopular, and to know that you would be ostracized from it, and the pain that would cause, but yet knew this was the right decision for you. So I just want to commend you, because it can be easy for one to hear, oh, okay, that makes sense. Of course you would do that. But once you're actually going through it, there is such immense tension and pain, and trauma, and loss. I mean, there's just so many things. It's so complex.
Well, I think the more people that talk about it at the varying levels, the more those trapped in those systems are able to go, oh, I'm seeing these same factors in my life. who do I want to be? And if they can do it, I can do it. Like I'm a huge believer that as we inform in gentle ways, especially through stories, or, your book, where it's let me introduce you to these topics in a way that is non-threatening to you, that our minds are more open, and then we're able to make those changes that we want. As people have read my book, they're like, I can see these similarities. Now that I can see those, I'm more willing to speak out and live that, authentic to myself, but also in that wise mind, that gray zone. Um, I find that there's great value in sharing those stories and those examples. I think that, what happened in Nazi Germany is horrific. I think it's from a social standpoint, it has traumatized the entire world in certain ways, and that we are still seeing, as you talked about, those generational traumas, because most of the people who lived during that time, most of them have now passed on. But as we continue to read those stories and understand that history, we're able to say, yes, look at these Nazi Germans who were good people who got caught up in doing horrific things. What was going on for them? Oh my goodness, I can see those tendencies in myself. I don't want to repeat that. How do I shift and change my thought processes and my behaviors in order to achieve that goal, that I can remain more humane, that I'm not going to, what did you say here? Disengage from my moral values, that I will remove myself from a feeling of moral superiority or a level of higher intelligence or holier than thou, or I'm better than everybody else, in order to stay where I want to be, so that the world over time becomes a much better place. So how would you encourage people to manage the stress of working through these systems? Like if they're identifying it either in the societies they're a part of, on the news, those types of things, what is your advice or your counsel for helping us manage that ostracization, the stress, the momentum that comes, that negative energy?
Yeah, I think this is connected to what we were just talking about. Paul and I write about that it's important to find meaning and purpose in your life. And that meaning and purpose can come from your trauma. And how powerful would that be if you allow yourself to be transformed, and even your identity formation to be positively impacted by such a negative thing that happened in your life? And there is this self-discovery and self-exploration that can occur. And if your focus is more on finding meaning and purpose rather than finding happiness,
Right.
I think that you'll find optimism along the way. It will take work. I have a great example. Magda Hertzberger, you were just talking about Holocaust survivors. She wrote a powerful book about her experience surviving a concentration camp as a young girl. All of her family members were brutally murdered. She was separated from them, no known information. And she was giving up. Her will to live was dying. And she looked at a tree in the camp and she saw little buds of flowers, they weren't open yet, but they were just these little tiny buds. And she said, this might be my last hope, but if God is showing me that life exists, even here at the ugliest place that it could ever be, she was having to drag human remains into ditches as a young girl. That was her job. And yet she saw signs of life at the camp, and she said, I'm going to hang on because God is showing me a sign, and there's hope. I'm going to keep holding on to that hope. as dark of a place that she lived in, and sometimes people's realities are so bleak, so dark, there is no light. But if there
Right.
can be a shred of hope that keeps them going, knowing that, let me just keep surviving and see, let me just keep finding that motivation to keep going and persevere and turn something negative into something that can be really powerful. It still doesn't have to feel good. It still can feel painful, but yet it's informing me in my life. It was within weeks that the camp was liberated. And she ended up marrying an American soldier who came and liberated the camp. It's a beautiful
Right.
love story. And she has children and has an amazing legacy. And she writes poetry and composed music. And to think like this woman who survived, like she was giving up on life. And
Yeah.
Viktor Frankl writes about that, surrendering that will to live. And at that point, people inevitably died because there was just really no hope to persevere. And I think that is really the biggest life lesson here is, trauma will happen, losses will happen, people we love will die, we will lose our jobs, we will lose our money. Things can change inevitably. And
And
but
very quickly.
and it can happen very quickly or
Just
even
like
very
that.
slowly.
Mhm.
It could even be more painful and slow. I mean, there's just so much variation out there.
Yeah.
And nobody can live that struggle except you. No one's going to know what that struggle feels like except you. But you can choose not to do it alone. You can choose to
Mhm.
let people in, and to find that hope to keep going and persevere. And sometimes it's a day at a time. Sometimes it's a minute at a time. Um, and I think that those are really powerful stories that really stick with me. And I think about my parents. I mean, the courageous plight that they had to, not fight, not defend, but save the family and
Right.
leave and go, flee, like live on, survive. And
Yeah.
in fact, last year, well, Paul and I released our book in December of last year, and it actually commemorated the 50th year anniversary of my grandfather's disappearance. And we have pictures of him in the book. We talk about his story. And I felt like there was a spiritual justice that was
Right.
served, by informing the public and community and, um, you know, making him more tangent, like making him living, like bringing him back into
Right.
the living. I felt like it served a sense of spiritual justice against his persecutors and perpetrators and those who had killed him and tortured him. And I felt like you tried to make him disappear and be unknown, but
Right. But he
it
lives
worked
on.
against you. He lives on, exactly.
Right.
Um, and so people can find their own ways of restoring what they feel had been lost or taken from them in more, pro-social ways. And it takes energy, it takes effort, it might take fight, but preserving that optimism, knowing your truth, finding your own agency. Paul and I have a whole back section of our book that we commit to these. We call them like golden threads or things that we've learned,
Mhm.
and through my work, through his work. He's had to deal with a lot of challenges politically and also um, working now on political reform. Uh, and we just find that these are the gifts that people have shown us and that we found also in our own work in life.
Right. I love that. I love the idea that in order to achieve that, in order to achieve meaning in our struggle and in our trauma, we have to get familiar with feeling uncomfortable. We have to get familiar with defying the odds, with thinking outside of the box. And that as we very slowly develop that skill, we are able to breathe life in back into humanity. And as you said, you were able to bring your grandfather's sacrifices and challenges back to life so that his story of suffrage and his victimization empowers the people that have come after him, because they are able to say, that was not okay, and I will live my life in such a way that that does not happen on my watch, that I will not allow myself to fall into those patterns, because I never want to bring that harm to anybody for any reason ever. But in order to get there, in my opinion, you have to familiarize yourself with struggle. And that does take a great deal of courage, because the natural human tendency is, this is hard. Let me choose the path of least resistance. Let me get my brain and my body right back into that place where I'm comfortable and I feel safe. And it's oxymoronish to think that I have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, but rather as we familiarize ourselves, our brain allows us to think more clearly when things feel wrong, so that way we don't fall in step with those who are harming others in a way that does not align with us. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Absolutely. Or blindly participating, or, condoning, even though you're not acting. And so you think you're less worse than others because, you're just kind of going along with it, but not really saying or doing anything against
Right.
it.
Turning a blind eye to it. Oh, that's not my business. Therefore, I'm just going to put on some blinders and pretend it's not happening right next door to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. So how do we protect our children from this? Like, as parents, what can we do to help our children avoid the mistakes of our past?
Yes, I think, going back to self-agency now, if you are a parent and raising children, or even thinking about reparenting yourself. I do this in therapy
Oh,
all
I
the
love that phrase. Yeah, I use that in therapy all the time. You've got to parent yourself. I love
time. Parent your inner
reparenting
child.
yourself. Yes. Yes, keep going.
So, empower the youth in pro-social ways so that they feel more in control of their own self-determinism, rather than enraged by those who has oppressed or restricted their freedoms. And so this goes back to the idea and notion of self-agency, which Paul and I write about and speak about. It's really a mindset. It's adopted through learned behavior. Having agency is really the belief that you have self-efficacy, so that self-control, that ability to inform and determine the outcomes that shape your life. And it's a belief in yourself, about your own inner strength and your resilience and your adaptability. And you were talking about earlier, like being able to really tolerate discomfort. It may not be that you do anything, but just do nothing and experience discomfort. That's it. That is hard. So,
It is hard. So what
and
does that look like? Like, if I'm a parent and I'm going, okay, am I self-actualized? Am I confident? Am I, this sentence of, I'm not taking things personally. What does that look like in our day-to-day lives?
yeah, so while we can always change the narrative we have about ourselves, how parents interacted with us has a tremendous impact in shaping our self-construct, internal scripts, and worldview. So as adults, we in turn play a larger role in how our children will view themselves. So our goal as parents should be to raise children who are socially adept, emotionally intelligent, morally conscientious. We want them to be ambitious and productive members of society. So we should want them to be independent thinkers, not persuaded by peer pressure to engage in harmful behaviors, and really maintaining that self-confidence that is not overcome by fear and anxiety.
Right.
So, I think not alienating, we don't want to alienate children, but we have to give them some sense of freedom to be able to learn on their own. Paul and I developed this acronym called TRIPLED, and it's designed to help you think about this balance necessary to give your child agency. So it's not always easy. It takes time, love, dedication, repetition, as we know, and to help them become self-reliant. So that stands for truth, respect, independence, purpose, love, engagement, and deliver. I'll just define it really briefly. So truth and trust are really interrelated, interconnected. Both are really necessary to build confidence and courage. You want the child to learn to trust themselves. I still work on this with adults and learning them to reparent themselves. And some of them will even say, like, I've never really trusted myself before. I don't even know what that feels like. I've always listened to what other people have told me and believed them over myself. And so that sometimes can feel very unfamiliar. Respect the rights of every individual, even if you're disagreeing with them, as we were talking about before.
Right.
And even your own children, treating them with respect and having expectations, and knowing that they can handle it, trusting that they can rise to the occasion. Independence. So we want to promote the sense of individuation, that they have this own separate mind from us. And this own separate developing autonomy, and that will help to build their strength, but it also comes from strength. As I talked about before, the purpose, really finding meaning and purpose, these are key to a valuable life, not necessarily driven by finding happiness or things that are just, short-term, in the moment, fulfilling, because that just deteriorates and it's all illusory anyway. So beware of those short-term gratification, delayed gratification. I have a toddler, so I'm like, everything is all about like delayed gratification. Build her tolerance, teach her the emotions. Love, treating yourself and others with dignity, kindness, value, and love. Engagement, really participating and collaborating to something greater that you belong to. And deliver. I mean, they have to be accountable and reliable. I teach this to adults all the time. Like, we need an accountability partner for you. Like, who are you going to report to when you do this? It can be me or somebody else. Prove yourself in your actions more than your words.
Yeah, I love this. So, we were talking before we went live. I have 7 children. It's a lot. I was Mormon.
I think it's amazing. I'm impressed.
one moment at a time. But some of the values, when my husband and I got married, our goal was to parent completely differently than our parents had, because we wanted to make sure that our children were safe, had a voice, and felt heard in our family. We did not want them to fear us. We wanted them to obey because they are not obey. We did not want them to obey. We wanted them to be good humans and make good choices that benefited them and others, because it was something innate in them, rather than be obedient because they were afraid of us. And so some of the things that, through trial and error, that Mason and I learned over the course of raising, so again, my oldest just turned 22, is, things like, we got rid of the idea that when there was a disagreement, there was a right or a wrong answer, or that there was a winner and a loser in the argument. Like, we just got rid of that language. And instead we really leaned into, what the Gottmans, Doctors John and Julie Gottman, do with, I want to understand your point of view. I want to make a safe environment in our home where we don't have to agree, but I value you as a human. And the way that we got there was, we listened to understand, we validated those things that once we understood their point, we validated it. We gave it this weight of, I don't see it that way, but I can see why you do, and understanding your point of view, I can see how this is important to you, and making statements like, I really admire the fact that you can speak up even though, Dad or I don't feel that way. I think you need to keep doing that, especially if it resonates with you. Like, we did our best, and we succeeded many times. We failed many more times, I'm sure. But our goal in our home was to make it so that our children could have that safe environment to try these skills on, so that when they are, now I've got, let's see, 1, 2, Katie, Hayden, Brig, and Eric. Four of my 7 children are teenagers or adults. And I absolutely love the fact that they can come home and we'll be having a conversation and they'll be able to say, no, I disagree with this. I think it's this way. This is kind of where my focus is. And as a family unit, we can say, wow, I love that focus. I love that direction. How can we support you? And those types of things. And then the other thing that we worked really hard on doing was, you talk about accountability. My 17-year-old son Hayden the other day sent me a message over Facebook Messenger and said, "Hey mom, I don't feel like you're showing up for me in the way that I need you to. I feel like you're really distracted with promoting your book and it's my senior year." And ouch is right. Like I read that and my immediate response was, "You're right. My book
Cancel
has
the book
taken up." Right. I was already on the book tour. I was on the plane getting ready to fly home when I got this message. And I was like, you know what? You're right. Because I was on book tour, I missed out on your senior night for band, which is not something I would have ever missed for your brothers, your older brothers. My oldest 3 are boys, and then I've got a girl. And for me to be able to say, you know what? You're right. I am so sorry. I have been distracted. I have allowed this project of mine to absorb my time. And when I get home, let's sit down and talk about what your priorities are and how we can make sure that this does not continue to happen throughout the rest of your senior year. And so he and I have now had 3 conversations. And the reason it's been 3 is because we'll get partway in and we're like, okay, hey, we're not jiving. Let's take a break. Let's recuperate. Let's process what each other has said. And I think, it was either last night or was it this morning? Because we kind of followed up. We had a conversation last night and then again this morning. And I feel like he and I are on the same page. And that, as we've worked out how he needs me this year, his last year of high school, he has said, I want you to come to these specific events and I want you to ask me more about what I'm doing with college. I know that you trust me and I know that you've given me like, it's your choice. What do you want to do? Tell me where to show up, tell me where to be, tell me what college tours you want to go on. He was like, I think I need a little bit more check-in and a little bit more reassurance from you. And because he's able to tell me where I've messed up, and do so without that fear of me taking it personally and jumping down his throat, that in his adult life, the hope is that that will translate into being able to go to a boss or a professor or a spouse and say, hey, I need this from you in order to feel like a whole person. And then for us to talk about where we can comply with that, where we can't do that, where we disagree and where we agree. As we create these environments, then our kids can actually become that. We have to do it first as parents. We have to be able to say, hey, I can see these areas where I'm trying to force my child to view the world the same way I do. They can be good humans and have different opinions. I need to make space for them in our home to disagree with me and be valued and not cut down for that. I think that that is so powerful. And in my own life, I'm seeing how that has played out with my oldest 3. And yes, my oldest is 22. So let's see how it plays out as he's 30, 40, 50, 60. And we pass on. But I think that, for my listeners, I would challenge them to evaluate how you're showing up in your child's life and how the environment in your home is. Can your child come in and have a different political view than you? Can they have a different religious view? Can they have differing ideologies? Can they, are they allowed to do this in your home? And what happens when they do? And find out where we're trying to marginalize or polarize belief systems and views. And when I catch so I've got a porcupine daughter right now who's 14, and my husband and I were able to sit down with her the other day and say, hey, Dad and I are noticing that, you're kind of viewing all of these things that are happening in your life 100% negative, we'd like to challenge you to find the silver lining. We want to be safe for you to talk about these hard things, but what we're noticing is you're being drugged down into this, everything's angry, everything's hard, everything. Can you help us understand what's going on? What's stopping you from balancing that out? And she said, I need to think about it and get back to you. And she's never come back to us with what she thought it was. But all of a sudden, we're seeing our child come back and be like, these were the good things. And I handled this negative thing this way, but I learned this. And so just that dialogue to be able to, come to somebody and say, hey, I'm a little bit concerned, without saying, you're doing this wrong and this wrong and this wrong, and you need to fix it like this and like this and like this, and do it or you're grounded, type of a thing. By giving our children those experiences and that safe place to fail or to be weak or to celebrate their strengths, I think is huge as we show up for our kids, parenting and helping them avoid that extreme. The extremism, I think, is very valuable.
Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Diagnose Zeithochdruck. Wir verschreiben ausreichend Zeit für PatientInnen. Herzlich willkommen im Krankenhaus St. Joseph Braunau. Jetzt bewerben als Ärztin oder Arzt für Innere Medizin. khbr.at/Karriere.
Yeah, and I really want to commend your son. I think if you being a parent too, and if this were me, it would be hard not to personalize it. But if I could step back and see, wow, this is a sign of success. Like he's assertive. He's telling me what he needs from me. He's speaking directly about the issues that are important to him. He has a direction of where he's heading. He knows specifically what he needs help for. And that's a sign of real strength. And I think to challenge authority is an important part of adolescence and development, and to point out frailty and imperfection in others, but also being able to see the vulnerability in oneself and being able to ask for help. All of that on a process level sounds like he's developing amazingly.
Right. So I just sent the screenshot of that initial conversation to Alex. Let's see if he can pull it up. I want to reassure the listeners. So Alex, if you can grab that photo and get that up here so that people can kind of see how we did that, because I want to lead by example, not be like, oh, look at me, shine a light on my awesome parenting moment. I want to make sure that people know I failed. Yeah, and it's going to take Alex a second because he has to convert it to PDF in order for it to upload appropriately in StreamYard. But I want the listeners to know I learned that because I failed many, many times before this moment with my son, Hayden, and that I had to get to a place where I could fail safely. In my home environment, when we talk about that generational trauma, I wasn't allowed to fail. If I failed in my home, love was withdrawn. And so as I was able to process that trauma in my growing up years and say, okay, I want to do things differently, I was able to identify, I want my children to fail and feel loved, which means I have to fail and still feel loved. And that really turned into, I have to be able to fail and still love myself. And so, I think that as parents, oftentimes we'll read these parenting books and whatnot, and it's a lot of theory, but then turning all of that theory into what I'm actually doing in my day-to-day life, there's a translation, there's a gap there that we have to work through. And I think it starts, I mean, we can start at any point in our parenting, but especially for those when you've got those kiddos, you had said, Emily, that your toddler, will have a meltdown or something, and that your goal is to allow them to feel that full range of emotions. That's a great place to start. I started there after I went to school and learned how to do it. My poor oldest, he got all the mistakes, Mama. But as my younger kids, as we allow them to feel and make space for that, it really helps them. But we have to. So that's my son's conversation with me, and then below is his pictures because he got nominated for Homecoming Queen there. So I'll just read that. Yeah. So my son is in the purple. So for those who are just listening, my son thought I was ignoring him because my phone wasn't getting the text. So the first thing is I said, I'm so sorry if you felt like I was ignoring you. I wasn't. I feel awful. Dad said you are a little frustrated with me. So pointing out what I did well, I opened up the conversation to Hayden to say, Dad says you're feeling frustrated. I'm allowing him to approach me with that. And he says, I love you, Mom. I'm just having a really hard time feeling like you want to be there for me. And I said, yeah, I get that. My book stuff and work stuff has absorbed me, and I haven't been there for you like I was for Eric. I will fix it. Thank you for telling me. Love you with my entire soul. And then we had the conversations later. But the example here that I want to demonstrate, which again, please understand, it took me years to get to a place where I could do this, is I opened up the conversation for him to express his concerns. He opened with, I love you, like that reassurance of my frustration doesn't change my underlying love and appreciation for everything that you've done, but here's my concern. And then I validated his concern and I grew his concern. I allowed me to say, yep, you're right. I haven't been showing up for you the way that you need me to. This is probably why. I'm committing to fix it. And I want you to know that I love you too, that my absence has nothing to do with a lack of love, but rather it has to do with a mistake I'm making as a parent, as a frailty. And that as we do that with our children, as we show them that we make mistakes and that we can recover from them with grace, as we show them how to have discussions where we all disagree, as we demonstrate that and engage with our children in that way, their ability to retain these lessons moving forward in their life is much better. So we got to do a lot more than lip service. So thank you for letting me share that with you. And thank you, Alex, for your magical PDF. Fingers in the background, very quick. So, yeah.
Yeah, modeling is an important part. My daughter is definitely teaching me that, I might have an intention of, okay, this is what I'm going to focus on teaching my daughter this week. But what she's really absorbing is what I'm doing and modeling to her. And so it's so important that we're even, hyper aware of what we're doing without intentionality, because they're really absorbing more of that, I think, picking that part up. So there's so much, tradition and habit and what we learned in our families of origin that come through. And as we may be doing this work of like, okay, well, how do I want to do this in the best way that I can? What do I want to focus on, this week, can be helpful as kind of a guiding principle, and, supporting their growth and development. Because one thing we know inevitably, especially with kiddos, is change. Change will always happen. Once you feel like you've got them in a routine, they'll just bring up some other kind of challenge. So that adaptation, that flexibility, I really try not to engage in a power struggle with my daughter.
I love that.
That can be a challenge. one
Yes.
visual I tend to have with clients, because I also try not to engage in a power struggle with my clients, which can happen,
Yeah.
is I like to sit with them, or at least envision symbolically that I'm sitting with them, next to them on their side of the table or on their side of the couch, looking from their perspective at the issue, even if the issue is me. And that can be
Right.
hard because we have to really extract the personalization of the issue. But looking at it from their perspective takes some work. And it can also help to diffuse that defensiveness, because we
Mhm.
can oftentimes respond defensively and
Right.
and engage in blaming and shaming the child,
Right.
and especially if it's behaviors that we don't approve of, and I think use that very cautiously, because what it says to the child, especially with shaming, is that you're not worthy.
Right.
And really what you want to tell them is, I just don't approve of your behaviors. It's okay that they feel guilty. That's actually a good thing, because that
Right.
promotes
Guilt is good.
behaviors. But we don't want to inherently leave them with the message that they're undeserving of love or they're not worthy.
Right.
Because that has other long-term complications and problems.
Right. Yeah. I love that. And I think it comes back to what you were talking about earlier with that ego fragility. As we build strength and recognize I can postpone, my hurt by the fact that a mistake I've made has been pointed out, so that I can tune in to the person who is expressing how I've wounded them. It just has such long-lasting benefits of connection, as long as both people do get that. We can't always be one-sided. It also has to go both ways. But yeah, I think that as we work on showing up for our children differently than, like I said, shedding right or wrong, winning or losing. I love that you brought up a power struggle. Because when we talk about that extremism, like you said earlier, there was that separation of the person who is above and the person who is below. And obviously, at times in our children's life, like when they're toddlers, we are above them in order to keep them alive for their own well-being. But that as they grow up, we need to equalize. We need to equalize that. It's no longer that power struggle. It's no longer, I need you to do this just because I said so. Rather, it's going to be, taking a I'm not a huge fan of all of the Love and Logic parenting style, but taking a page from that book of allowing the child to set their own boundaries and their own limits, and me as the parent supporting them in that, and then allowing them to fail, allowing them to experience the natural consequences of the decision. It just, I think it really helps our children have that better rounded view, so that they learn how to have grace for those who are different or believe different. And I think that it really minimizes violence, extremism, polarized thinking, and a tendency to cause harm later in life. So
Yeah, absolutely. You're approaching issues with this openness and calmness and strength, and allowing yourself to also be informed and changed by the interaction, by the other person. And I think that is, there's no greater I think sign of respect to another individual than really saying, like, you changed my views on this. You made me think differently about this.
right.
Now I'm changing my behaviors on this because I've been transformed by you. And I think even for my clients, I will tell them that, like, you taught me this. I just want to let you
Right.
know that. And what a powerful gift that is,
I
to
love that.
to be inspired by another person. I think that is our legacy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So is there anything else you wanted to share with us before we close up today? Any last thoughts you have, or
Yes, I would
tips
love
or
to
tricks you
invite you
have?
as a guest at our show. This has been really enjoyable. I've really appreciated, some of the complementary dynamic and like really trying to attack some of these complexities and complex issues that are happening. Whether you're a parent or you or a loved one is really trapped in some kind of ideology or at risk of being radicalized, or engaging in extremism. So I think, there's quite a lot to be enriched and learn from. And I think the biggest theory here is really looking at the individual itself and really taking control of your life and having power over the consequences of your decisions in what you choose to do or say or act.
Mhm.
And and that will have a ripple effect, and being able to speak up and protect. I think there is one other thing I want to say. If there are parents who do have youth that they're concerned about being radicalized, or even family members that they're concerned of being radicalized, there's a lot of research out there, and even from my own personal experience in doing this work, the it doesn't help to challenge them head on by telling them that they're wrong.
Mhm.
And this kind of goes along with, we were talking about the shaming and the guilting of the child. But even in an adult conversation, like just telling them that they're wrong, and engaging in like fact finding information to show that their conspiracy theories aren't true, or don't have a solid foundation, or their views are distorted and not based in reality. It doesn't help them. It pushes them further away and further isolates them.
Well,
And
because
so,
doesn't it like reinforce their belief system? Like when you come head on and you're like, you're not doing it right. You're not in their brain, they're like, oh yeah, I'm right because I was expecting people to come at me and tell me I was wrong. Isn't there I'm trying to remember what that's called. Because like in religious stuff, we call it the backfire effect, where if you're like pushing, no, your religion is based on these, things that aren't great, that it ends up feeling like an attack. And so that activates the amygdala. And so they go further into the belief system, further into the conspiracy theory, further into the extremism, rather than waking up to what you're trying to share with them.
yeah, there's a self-protective response that gets activated there. There's lots of different things that could be going on,
Right.
social, psychologically, and in terms of perspective taking, or defense mechanisms that are going on there. But I think the best thing, just as a quick tip, is find a way to align with this person, see the shared humanity in them. Even if it's not about the issue at hand, but finding something that you can do with them, if you can ground them back in their identity in which they had before they started engaging in this extremist views, that's going to create some kind of a buffering and a protective factor, because now they're saying, oh, this person sees me and experiences me in the identity that I had before. And that's the part that you really want to speak to and hold on to and create that lasting relationship with. It'll protect them. And there's all other different kinds of tips and strategies, depending on where someone's engaged in that
Can we
extremist.
read about those in your book?
Yes. And Paul and I also
Awesome.
created worksheets. I think, if somebody just wants like some quick tips, and I'm happy to share the links with you if you wanted to cross post them. Some worksheets in working with people who have been absorbed or pulled into these various forms of addictive ideologies, and helping people who are addicted to them. That might be
Yeah.
helpful.
Absolutely, yes. Please email us all of your links and whatnot, because we will put those in the show notes and make sure that our listeners have access to those. And then just for clarification, your book is available on so I know it's available Kindle and then paperback, correct? What about Audible? Is it on Audible?
Yes, it is. Paul and I are narrating it, and my mom is actually offering prayers and proverbs in other languages. So that's
Oh,
all in there.
fun. So yes, I'm going to encourage our listeners, if you want to learn more about this topic, and really dig into this, I think that would be a very valuable endeavor. Mostly because you can take the lessons from this book and then apply them across multiple modalities, multiple different areas in your life, again, from that micro system all the way to the macro system. And so there's going to be some parallels that you're able to draw from. I want to encourage our listeners to reach out to Emily if you have questions. Take a look at her website. We will absolutely be posting those links, because I want you to have the material that you need and the data that you need in order to make the changes in your life that you are hoping to make. So, Emily, do you have any last thoughts?
No, I want to thank you for taking this topic and really helping to prevent growing extremism, and being a model citizen yourself. And, how does one find a way to meaningfully continue to engage in civics and civic engagement and have my own personal responsibility? What does that look like for me? And each path is unique. But rather than just saying, I don't want to participate, this is ugly, I don't like the way this feels, I'm going to turn everything off and just dissociate. And I think that there is a trend and tendency that's there, but I see, complicity.
You can
Let me say that one more
you
time.
can make up your own words. It's fine. We do that all the time on this podcast.
Psychologists do that. Thank you, Alex, for editing. Just a shout out to you. But there are dangers in complicity.
Mm-hmm.
By not acting out, not saying what you believe, not standing up for your opinions if you're seeing that things are wrong or unjust or unfair or immoral or unethical. And there are dangers to that because we all contribute to the society that we want to live in. And if we're choosing not to participate and yet want it to be utopian, that's not going to happen without your engagement.
Right. We have to actually put in the effort to achieve, I always think of the movie Miss Congeniality, world peace. It's, yes, while we may say world peace is not possible, improvement in our society absolutely is. And in order to get there, we all have a part that we have to play. So thank you so much, Emily, for joining us today. Again, to my listeners, the book is Addictive Ideologies. And I cannot read the subtitle. Alex, can you pull the big subtitle up for me again? Because I am blind today. There we go. Addictive Ideologies, Finding Meaning and Agency When Politics Fail You, by Dr. Emily Bashah and Paul Johnson. Thank you so much. I feel that this has been an absolutely wonderful and engaging conversation. I think that our listeners will have found great benefit in this. And it's a little bit different than what we normally do here at Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma, which I absolutely love, because our goal here is to provide really solid psychoeducational material so that our listeners can improve the quality of their life, the quality of the communities that they live in, and make social change that is lasting and meaningful.
Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is hosted by Sarah and Mason Westbrook, produced by Daisy Girl Communications, LLC, and Alex Vidalis. Please join our community on Facebook. Music provided by Musa and John Worthy Music.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? The things you know make you feel better even when it's impossible to make time for them. Like that workout you try to squeeze in between kids' activities, work, and everything else you have going on, and before you know it, it gets pushed to tomorrow. Sound familiar? But it's the moments when you feel like you have no time for yourself when those non-negotiables are more important than ever. Those are the things that keep you strong, healthy, motivated, and prepared to take on everything life demands of you. So why not make therapy one of them? BetterHelp Online Therapy makes it easy to get started with affordable phone, video, or live chat sessions you can do from anywhere, and the option to message your therapist between sessions if anything comes up. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.